And let's see, we're recording, so you all take it away.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you all for being here. It's nice to see you again. It's been a while since our first November meeting. I am Iman, and I'm the Education Program Associate, and today I'm joined by my colleague, Katie. You want to introduce yourself, Katie?
Hi, all. I'm the program coordinator. We work really closely together. And Iman's probably going to say this, but our fearless leader, Sarah, is currently out on maternity leave, which you might know, which is very exciting.
Yeah. So we're excited to pick back up where we left off. Back in November, we introduced you to the power of question formulation and gave you some research behind that, and also took you through an experience in the question formulation technique. But today we're going to build on that and go into the nitty-gritty of designing to bring your own QFT lessons into your classroom and do it well. All of today's materials, including this PowerPoint, can be found at an event page on our website. So I think Katie will share a link and we'll make sure you all have it on hand. And you'll also find all the materials from our November session. And you can always feel free to use and share our resources. So looking ahead to our next meeting in March, that's going to be all about facilitation of the QFT, which can be a bit of an understandable learning curve. And it's also going to be dedicated to pictures of practice. So we're going to have a special guest speaker, a super experienced classroom teacher who will be joining us, and they'll share a bit about their own work, bringing the QFT into their classroom and provide some practical advice for you all. And we'll also have the Q&A. So, we're big on questions. And then after today, we're going to give you a little bit more homework to finish your own QFT lesson, and we'll give you a tool to do that. And we're also going to ask you all to practice facilitating the QFT at least once. So some of you might feel ready to go off and do it with your own learners, your whole class, and that's awesome. Feel free to do that. But for some of you who want to take some more time to play around with all the other parts of designing a lesson, we appreciate that too. So all we want you to do is ask a colleague or a family member, maybe a couple volunteer students to help you out, and you'll just get a taste of the experience facilitating. So we'll tell you more about that at the end. So you may or may not remember, but this is the process we took you through in November. This is the QFT. And today is going to be all about breaking down each of these 5 parts and figuring out how you can design a lesson that accomplishes each of these 5 parts. But before we get any further, reflection is really important to us. So we want you all to take a minute and think about either a question you're coming into today with, or something new that's occurred to you since last time. How are you thinking differently now about questioning or questions or curiosity? So take some time, and when you're ready, please share a piece of that reflection in the chat, and Katie will read some of those out.
And I know some of our folks on here had some outstanding lesson plans. I looked at those and they had submitted. I know Julie, you did a phenomenal job. I know I'm putting you on the spot, but for good cause, because your work was outstanding and so were the others. So we have some outstanding educators and talent with us here today. So don't be bashful. You all jump in and put in the chat and be proud of your work, because I sure am. And share out or put in the chat there. So just wanted to say that, but fantastic work.
Yeah, thank you. I'm really excited to learn more about the work you've been doing, and I appreciate all the work you have been doing on this. So thanks to those who are feeling a little bit brave and want to share.
Julie may be saying, Jim Evans, don't do that again. There she is. There you go. Yeah. There she posted. Thank you.
Okay. Oh, thank you, Julie. So she had a question. How do you help teach the idea of closed and open-ended questions to students, especially in elementary school? Thanks for that. I'm gonna try to save some of these.
Yeah, thanks, Katie. And if you have any other questions, continue to add those to the chat and we'll make a note of them and try to get to them. If not, the chat's always open, but thank you for taking some time to reflect. Today, we really are spending a lot of time on the art and science of the QFT. So we're going to talk about some of the work you have to do before you even begin planning your lesson. There's a little bit of thinking involved. And we know, since it's great to hear, a lot of you got a chance to fill out that Q-Focus design tool and come up with some of your stimulating prompt ideas. We're going to give you some time in breakout rooms to talk with one another and share those Q-Focus ideas and get some feedback that is helpful. And then finally, we're going to spend more time on each of these other parts of prioritization, categorization, and reflection, as well as facilitation. Okay, so we like to say that the QFT is both an art and a science, and I'll explain why in a bit. And this is going to be a really crucial resource to walk you through designing your lesson. This is our lesson planning workbook, which we will be sharing with you all and is also on our event page. If you filled out the Q-Focus design tool, that's like about a couple pages of work. And you're ahead of the game if you did that, because that fits into this workbook. So this workbook's just building on that initial brainstorming you've done. So we also know it might look a little daunting because it is 8 pages, and we appreciate that you're very busy people. But we would say it's helpful to go through at least once, even if you don't do it super thoroughly, because each section does have a lot of helpful tips and info. So if you even go through it once, that'll make all your subsequent QFT lessons a bit easier and help you understand the deliberation and planning that can go into it. Okay, so why is the QFT a science? It's a science because it's a rigorous protocol with specific steps and sequence, and it produces consistent results. So if you follow all of these parts of the QFT, the sequence, you're pretty much guaranteed to get a list of student questions. You're always going to have students generating questions. But it's also an art because there's a way to do it really well. In the same way that we know teaching is an art form, there's decisions you can make to tailor the process to your content and your learners to figure out what works best in your classroom. So in the Q-Focus design tool, you saw how question-focused design has a lot of room to play around with, and you have to make a lot of choices. But these are also all opportunities for you to tailor the QFT in planning how you use the questions after, in your prioritization instructions, in your reflection questions, as well as in the way you facilitate it. And we're going to start by starting at the end, which means we want you to think before you even get into picking those fun prompts or those complicated, provocative prompts, think about how you want to use the QFT. So this is a scale to show the spectrum of ways that you can use it, anywhere from a 5 to 10 minute do now to this large scale, weeks long project or unit you can see. But a typical entry point and kind of the easiest way to get into it that we recommend to people is to do it in a one-day lesson. So if you all have a 45 or 50-minute class period, that's plenty of time to go through the process for the first time and try it out. We also know that if you work with diverse learners or early learners, you might find that it works better for you to break up the process across a few days. So you might want to dedicate one day to generating questions with students, and then another to categorizing, and so on. So the more you play with it and get comfortable with it, the more you can see how you can do it really quickly or scale it up and carry it over longer amounts of time. There's also various teaching purposes for the QFT, such as engagement, research, formative assessment, summative assessment, peer review, skill development, or problem solving. But this is, again, spending that time before you get in too deep. Really consider if the QFT is the right tool for you to achieve your objective. it might make sense. Maybe you do want to elicit those authentic student questions. But Katie and I will be the first ones to tell you that it's not going to be the end all be all tool. It's just one great tool in your toolbox. So just think about whether it really does make the most sense, because we know you sometimes you have another agenda and you have to get through other things, and maybe this isn't the right time when you need student questions. So just think about whether it will accomplish your objective. And also think a little bit about how you want to use the questions students eventually ask after the QFT. Are you going to use those questions to propel something else? For instance, these are all examples of ways to use student questions after the QFT. You see exit tickets or do nows, or to help students prepare questions for a guest speaker, or even just to help kick off a class discussion. These are all concrete next steps options. But we also want to assure you that sometimes the student questions don't have to go anywhere, and they don't have to lead to any concrete next steps assignment. You might find that the questions tell you a lot about what your students do or don't know, and that's still valuable, because then you might need to tailor your instruction, you might need to adjust a lecture, or you might need to just choose different materials for your next steps. So that's still kind of an assessment tool, a barometer for you. But also, we fundamentally believe there's so much value in making that space for students to ask questions. Regardless of whether it goes anywhere, asking the question is valuable in and of itself. I'm sure you all know that if the student asks a question, they're going to be a bit more invested in what they're learning. So lots of options, and sometimes none of these. Okay, so I'm going to hand it over to Katie. That was it for starting at the end, but the big takeaway is just that there's some important work and planning for you to do before you choose your Q focus. Okay, all yours, Katie.
Thank you. Yes, so I'm going to talk about Q focus design, which is probably one of the more difficult parts of designing a QFT, or something that's maybe less intuitive than the other parts of the lesson design. It's probably something new. So if you were feeling that way, you're not alone, and you'll get past it quickly. You'll become a pro at designing Q focus prompts very soon. We can go to the next slide. So just a reminder, the Q focus is a stimulus or prompt for student questions, and it can really be anything except for a teacher question. And Sarah may have talked about this, but the reason for not having it be a teacher question is because students are likely to then want to answer your question or to make their questions sound like yours. So we find that it kind of closes off that divergent thinking and the kind of ownership over the process. So, but it can be any of these other things. Next slide. And there are a few guiding principles for designing a Q focus that might be helpful to follow. So basically 3, number 4 is just that it's not a question, just to emphasize that. But your Q focus should be directly tied to your main objective. It should be simple, but not too simple, and interesting or provocative to students, but not heavy-handed or leading. And we're gonna look at, yeah, thanks, you can go to the next one. We're gonna look at a couple real examples from teachers. These were given with their permission. These are people we've worked with over the years who had a Q focus that they maybe initially weren't so happy with the results. And I think looking at those sort of non-examples is actually a really good way to learn something about Q focus design and how to really live into those principles. This will probably happen to you. You'll probably have a QFT lesson that isn't exactly the way you wanted it to go. And that's some of the greatest learning opportunity to think back about the design. Okay, what could I have done differently with the prompt that might have led the questions more in the direction I wanted? So this is an example from a 6th grade class, and this was at the very beginning of the year. the teacher wanted the students to ask questions about what it was going to be like to be a middle schooler, because this was their first time being middle schoolers. So really, what would the first few days of middle school be like? So the Q focus was this picture of the outside of their middle school. So can you go back one? Sorry.
Yeah, sorry.
I just want to take a minute and have you actually generate some questions. If you were given this prompt, what questions would you ask? What comes to mind when you see this picture? And you can go ahead and just put those in the chat. Or you can unmute and say it out loud because we're a small group. Why is there a steeple? Thank you. Is this a government building? Who lives here? Yes, thank you. So keep adding your questions and thinking about what you would ask. Why is it so old? Is there a basement? Great, thank you. So now let's look and see where are the people? Why are the windows tall? Thank you. So let's look and see what the sixth graders asked. And you can go ahead and click through. Thanks. So interestingly, somebody asked, why does it look so old? Which was one of your questions too. Why is there a flag hanging upside down? How much money did it cost to build it? When was the school made? So I'll give you a minute to just read through these questions. And then if you could share again in the chat or out loud what you're noticing about the questions. Yeah, what are you noticing about students thinking when you see these questions? And you can think back to what the teacher's objective was. So anything you're noticing as you're looking at these questions that they asked. Some open and some closed questions. Yeah, thank you. A lot of focus on the look of the building rather than the first days of school. Anything else you're noticing? They focused on the physical. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, feel free to keep adding many questions about the inside rather than the outside. Yeah. So I'm asking you this because the student questions can tell you a lot about what they're thinking and about how you design the lesson. So I'll just share that the teacher that did this lesson wasn't super happy with the questions. I think she wanted more of those questions about what it is like to be a middle schooler, to try to get out some of their concerns about entering school and it being the beginning of school. So any thoughts about what happened here, or sort of why, does anybody have thoughts about why this kind of didn't really get at what she was hoping to? And again, you can feel free to unmute or you can put it in the chat. The image is distracted from the Q focus. So this image was the Q focus, I believe. Yeah, this image itself was the Q focus. But yeah, thank you. So one thing I'll mention is just about thinking back to those guiding principles. I see another. May need an image within a classroom to spark questions about procedures. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so I like both Julie and Autumn are thinking about the image itself, and was there a different image that might have been better? And then, oh, Julie, did she say first few days of middle school or just show the image? So she just showed the image. So that's another idea potentially, is to maybe have added a phrase like first few days of middle school. And that's something you can do, is add an anchoring phrase, and it might help them get at your objective. So yeah, so I mean, my hypothesis is basically that in the teacher's mind, there was a connection to her objective, but it was more implicit than explicit. So students are super literal, you probably know this, and they're just going to ask about whatever you place in front of them. So they really were asking about this picture, you know, and they didn't see that implicit connection to the first days of school. So that may have been some of the solutions that you came up with may have been good to help tie it a little more. Okay, we can go to the next one. I'll show you another example. This is 11th grade. And this whole thing is the Q focus. So the students were reading The Plague by Albert Camus, and the teacher pulled these 4 passages from the text, and then also put sort of like a thematic statement in the middle. Individuals and organizations are similarly responsible in times of threat and crisis. So she thought that that was sort of the main idea of these 4 passages. So thinking back to our guiding principles, do you have any reactions, immediate reactions when you see this Q focus? And again, you can feel free to put it in the chat or unmute and share out loud. I know a lot of people are multitasking, so no worries. Iman, do you have any thoughts about this one?
It's going to take me a while to read all of the text on here. I cannot process it right away, is my thinking.
Yeah, that was my reaction too. So yeah, and Skylar said the same thing, lots of text to read. So I think this takes us back to that idea that a Q focus should be simple, but not too simple. And maybe this was a little bit much. I know that some students, you know, it would take them maybe even 30 minutes just to read all of these quotes and kind of digest them. Never mind asking questions about them. And, you know, you really want their brain power to be on the asking questions. So it may have been too much to process to really get into the QFT. So I'll show you how she revised it. So she just took one sentence from one of those passages and used that as a Q focus. And what I like about this is why we have these circles, is even though it's just one of the sentences, this sentence still has a lot of hooks for them. It still might be really interesting to them, especially 11th graders are going to be interested in decaying bodies and rodents. And this idea that, you know, people were aware that it was making people sick. So there's some intrigue in it. There are different roots, different little hooks within this sentence that they can shoot off of and ask questions about. And I think it still gets back to that main idea that she presented about organizations and individuals being responsible in times of crisis, but without spelling that out so much. Okay. Okay, so we're going to take you to first grade, and then I just have one more after this. So thank you for participating with me. So I know we're not all in first grade, but I think that this one is a really good example to that kind of applies across levels. So the initial Q focus was just people, animals, and friends. And again, I'm not going to give you the context just yet, but if you could just share in the chat, what are some questions that you would ask if you came across people, animals, and friends? Actually, don't show the questions yet, Iman. Sorry.
Oh yeah, I don't know why those are playing. Let me.
Oh, it might be a PowerPoint thing.
Yeah.
What kind of animals?
Sorry about that.
No, that's all right. Friends, family. Where do the people live? My pets. Yeah. How many families? Oh, my pets or animals at the zoo. Yeah. Thank you. So let's look at the first grader questions now. I love these questions. So I would just take a minute to read them if you can. I love, do people exist? It's very existential for first graders. And just like you, I feel like, similarly to the questions you asked, some students asked about, why do animals live in the zoo? Can you click through to the next one? Yeah, so I thought these in orange were all examples. Yeah, I feel like this is good for first. Many will go straight to statements. I have a pet. Yes. Thank you, Julie. Yeah, and it might be a good practice actually in turning statements into questions, which is something that we do in the QFT. But just like you, a lot of these students kind of picked up on one of the three words and ran with that. Why do animals live in the zoo? Why are friends fun? How do people smell? So they kind of went in all different directions. Can animals speak? Because they kind of took each individual thing and ran off with it. And then there are a few where the students did kind of connect the three concepts. Do people, animals, and friends play together? Why do people want to be friends with animals? And that was really the teacher's objective. So this was a unit, I think, about the fact that people need animals. And so she wanted them to kind of connect those three concepts. So I guess I want you to think now about how would you, knowing that that's the objective is sort of the connection between people, animals, and friends, how would you tell this teacher to revise their Q focus? What would you do instead? And you can go ahead and put some ideas in the chat box or share out loud. Oh, interesting. Separate them and do them individually. Thanks, Piper. Any other ideas? How would you revise this to get at the connection between people, animals, and friends? Oh, maybe say relationship between people, animals, and friends. Maybe have that as a key focus. Yeah, thank you. Any other ideas? How do people treat animals and vice versa? I think I would change that to say how people treat animals and vice versa, so that it's not a question. But I think that, yeah, thank you for sharing that. Yeah, great. So there's lots of, as you can see, there's lots of ways to play with it. Or what animals do for us. Yeah. These are great. Thank you. I think we heard one in a previous session I liked that was people plus animals equals friends. So there's a lot of different ways that you could play with those words and sort of try to get more at the relationship, which again was the objective. And I think that also helps this not be too simple. You know, this one was almost too simple for them in that it was these really broad topics that were unrelated. And if there's a way to relate them, you get more into that specificity. So those are a few examples. I'll show you one more. I won't make you participate too much in this one, but I'll just as another example. This one is really about that third principle, which is trying not to be too leading. So this was a teacher that wanted to kind of talk to students about technology use. And so they did a kind of a couple pictures, one of a student looking kind of upset, looking at their phone, and then this phrase, spread of smartphones and life of students. So maybe you can guess why this is leading, but for us, it was just that students probably know how you feel or think they know how you feel or how the adults in their life feel about their phones. Like this is one of those topics that they're going to think like, okay, I know what their point of view is here. I know what they're trying to get me to say. So that's just something to consider, that sometimes if students are already convinced, already think you're trying to convince them of a particular opinion, they're not going to feel like they can really authentically ask questions. They might feel cornered into a particular opinion. So I'll show you how the teacher ended up revising this one. So it really caused this teacher to consider, like, what is it actually about technology use that they wanted students to think about? And just to get more deep into what am I actually trying to get them to ask about? So it was really more about their online behavior and just being a good online citizen. And so they found this quote, how you behave online is how you are in real life. That's you. There's no separation. You are a person who says those kinds of things, by Mitch Gerards. So, so I think it's also useful in this context that they found a quote from someone else. Again, another way of separating kind of the teacher from the Q focus. So it's like, okay, somebody else said this, and now I want you to ask about this quote that somebody else said, and you could disagree with it, you know? So that's just one example of that third principle. All right, so yes, thank you so much for participating in the examples. We are now going to give you a little bit of time to go off into breakout rooms and talk about your own Q focus ideas. So you're going to be put into groups of 3. And you're going to each be sharing your Q focus and then getting feedback from your peers. So how we want to do this is, rather than the normal way of giving feedback, which would just be, you shouldn't do this, you should do this. We're going to ask you to try giving feedback in the form of questions. So in the same way that you sort of asked questions about the exterior of the building, or about people, animals, and friends, you're going to sort of just, the person's going to present their Q focus, and then the other 2 people are just going to ask questions, and you're going to be able to kind of anticipate then what students are likely to ask. And yes, Iman has just put the link to those instructions again in the chat if you need to reference them. And then after you have ask questions, then you can kind of debrief and say, okay, are those the kinds of questions I want to be getting from students? How do I need to revise to get more at the types of questions I want to get? Does that make sense? Any questions about what you're doing in the breakout rooms?
Anybody having questions? We've got directions there, Iman posted, and then how much time do we want to go?
Do we have 12 minutes, Iman, in our schedule?
I think we can do it.
Okay.
I think we can try.
Okay, so we're going to try 12 minutes, and that gives 4 minutes for each person to present your Q focus and then receive the feedback.
Okay, and I'm going to stop recording while we do that, and then I will go ahead and place everybody in a breakout room. And so here we go.
Thank you.
I just saw a pop-up I hadn't seen before. It says hold B to broadcast your voice to breakout rooms.
Oh,
Oh,
I'd
that
never
must be
seen that.
new.
It's on
Cool.
the top of my, it just popped up on the top of my screen. So I guess we can be I guess that's the letter capital B, hold B, I guess, and then we can be the voice.
Yeah,
So,
that's so useful because there's been no good way to communicate
yeah,
with the
so
breakout
that's
rooms. We might be a little short on time, so maybe we'll call them in a bit sooner,
Okay.
okay.
but I'm keeping a timer, so I'll let you know.
Okay, I was gonna put one on, but you got it, so you're good. And Donna and Natasha and Kendra may be driving or something like that, so I know we have that happen occasionally, and that's all okay. If you all aren't able to join the breakout room, you all just hang with us. That's okay.
Yeah, again, thank you for the multitasking. Does mean a lot that you still made it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Those first grader questions get me every time. So,
And sorry about my antics. I'm just, you all probably,
no,
please
Not at
close the
all.
breakout rooms and let's come back out. We gotta get him off of here.
not at all.
Not at all.
Okay, let me know. I have a hard time seeing everyone, so if it seems like everyone's back, I'll continue.
I think everyone's back. Yep.
Okay, great. Well, welcome back to the main room. I hope you all had some productive discussions, some helpful troubleshooting. One of the last times we asked you, but we'd love to do it. Could a couple people share in the chat at least something one of your group members shared with you or asked you that you found helpful, or maybe a change you feel like you're now going to try to make to your Q focus going forward? So don't have to read it out loud right now, but I think it'd be useful for all of us to see if you think it's worth sharing with everyone else your piece of advice. But the one major piece of advice from RQI co-founder Lou Santana is to have thick skin when you're facilitating the QFG, because you're taking a big risk and you're trying something new by designing a QFT. So things, as you saw in those examples we went through, things might not always go according to plan, but that's okay. Just roll it off your shoulders and it'll help you still when you try again and create your new lesson. So it's still a useful learning experience. Now we're going to talk about prioritization, and it comes down towards the end of the QFT process. But it is still a really important part of the QFT because it needs to align with both the Q focus you chose and your original teaching and learning objective. You might remember from our November session when we took you through an experience in the QFT, the instructions we gave you were to choose the 3 questions that you consider the most important. But you could also ask the 3 that you're most curious about. Those are what we call the standard general starter instructions. But these are also examples of a ton of other ways to make your prioritization instructions more specific to your objectives. So you see one teacher asks, choose 3 that are not Googleable and maybe difficult to answer, or 3 that a scientist studying the Earth might ask, or even 3 that we could answer using math. So you can really shape the questions your students choose with your instructions. And it's also just more fun for students if you're always shaking it up and choosing different instructions. You can also use prioritization to troubleshoot. So this is an example of a Q focus planned by an AP US history teacher. She gave them this quote by Maya Angelou: "History, despite its wrenching pain, cannot be unlived, but if faced with courage, need not be lived again." I would need to sit with that quote more to understand it. Maybe some of you feel the same way, but this teacher wanted her students to ask questions, really big questions, abstract questions about history, and she wanted them to be questions that they could revisit throughout the school year. But instead, they focused a lot on the speaker of the quote. They asked, who is she? Why did she say this? what about her experience can't be unlived? Double negative, but questions all about her. But the teacher did some quick thinking, and rather than saying, okay, this lesson was a bust, let's scrap this, she changed her prioritization instructions to be, choose 3 questions you feel best lend themselves to a year-long exploration of history. So she still was able to redirect her students and get them a bit more on track to what her initial goal was by changing those instructions. Okay, we're also revisiting our first grade friends and their kind of sad questions. You can see here, there's all the individual questions we saw, but our colleague Sarah, when this teacher was like, ugh, what do I do with these questions? This isn't what I was looking for. Sarah suggested to make the instructions instead choose 3 questions that have the words people, animals, and friends in them. So that's a really clear direction to students. And it was helpful because it points them to these questions that do feature all 3 words. And those end up being the questions that do speak a little bit more to the relationship between people and animals. So there's also not a lost cause. Okay, and now Katie is going to close this out.
Thank you. So reflection questions, that's another thing that you can change up a little bit and kind of tailor to the situation. You don't have to use the same questions every time. And yes, reflection is the last step on the QFT, last but not least. So the typical questions that we would ask are, what did you learn and how did you learn it? But there's so many different things that you can ask students. So I see it as even another way that you can kind of get the train back on track if you want. So maybe they didn't talk a lot about history, but they talked a lot about Maya Angelou, and maybe your reflection question is, what did you learn about history? Or, you know, you can kind of steer them back towards what you really want them to take away from the lesson. And we like to say you can think about asking about the process, you know, have them think about questioning as a process. So, you know, how can you use what you learned about asking questions? How do you feel about asking questions? How has your thinking changed since we last did the QFT? Or you can have them think more deeply about content. You know, what do you understand differently now about X topic? Or how did your questions help you think about this assignment we're doing, this essay we're doing? Can go to the next slide. And the last really important thing about reflection is just not to skip it. It can be tempting because it's the last step and sometimes you run out of time. But it's really the piece that kind of cements the process for students. And it's the thing that they take away and that really sticks in their brain once they've reflected on what they did. And this is a great quote from one teacher we worked with from the Boston Public Schools, Linda Chesnakis, and she said, reflection is the piece that keeps me coming back the next day. The most profound reflections are almost always from the students who perhaps seem disengaged in class. Quiet students often do a great deal of their thinking in the written reflection. So maybe there's a student that didn't say anything the whole QFT process, but they wrote this really profound reflection at the end, and it's really just that they were thinking and processing the whole time, and it comes out at the end. Great. So you've heard a lot about different ways that you can tailor and design the QFT. There's one more piece, which is about how to facilitate the process, the actual kind of attitude and, you know, approach you go in when you do facilitate the process. And that one we'll talk more about next time. We'll actually spend some time on it, but we'll give you a quick sneak preview now. So these are our kind of principles for facilitating the process. So We say facilitate because that's really the type of role you're in as a teacher when you're doing the QFT, since it's so student-led. You're really just kind of setting up the space for them to go forth and do the thinking and working themselves. And so these are a couple kind of guidelines we like to follow. As a facilitator, you're just monitoring student adherence to the process. You're trying not to give the students examples, trying not to get pulled into group discussion, and as much as possible, acknowledging all contributions equally. So that might look like saying the same thing to every student. Like we often say, thank you to all of your comments. And that's just a way to kind of move less away from the teacher validation and really get the students to validate themselves and have interest in asking questions for the purpose of it, and not because the teacher said, awesome, that was a great question. That's probably the toughest one. People often say that's the toughest one because you want to build students up. And so you say, awesome, that's great. But then if the next student gets a, you know, they might feel not as good. So that's one to practice too. So I would just think about these ones a little more, take them with you as you do your homework, and we'll debrief and reflect on them next time. And so, yeah, so in a nutshell, as you know, the science of the QFT is that it's a protocol, it's a step-by-step process, and the art of the QFT is you as the designer. And that is not a role to be taken lightly. You can really be the difference between an okay, meh lesson and one that really sings and really sticks with you for the rest of the unit or year. So that's a really important role. Am I still going on?
Up to you. I can close this out because
Okay.
I bad cop and I'm giving you homework, but I hope it's fun and useful to you. So as I mentioned, before we meet again next time, we want you to fill out this lesson planning workbook, which I just put in the chat, but it's also on our event page to download right away as a PDF or a Word document. So if you've done the QFocus planning tool, the design tool, that was homework for today, you're set. If you haven't fully gotten to do that yet, that's okay. And you're going to be filling it out by doing this whole workbook as well. So those 2 pages fit into this 8-page document. And also, before we meet again, we just want you to practice facilitating the QFT. So we haven't given you a ton yet about facilitating, but we're asking you to try and follow those 4 principles and see how it feels for you, and take note of what feels challenging or surprising, and we'll get to discuss that more on March 2nd. So a little less time apart than between now and November. And yes, I don't know if you have access to this on hand, Katie, but if you could just put today's event page once more, that has all of our materials. There's also, I forgot to mention, I believe, we have a timing guide. I'm sure a lot of you might have questions about just how do you make it work with the time you have. So we have a timing guide up on our event page that gives you some suggestions depending on the amount of time you have for how to pace the QFT. Thank you, Katie. And yeah, that's it. So we have just a couple minutes left. So we're here and available if you have any questions we can answer, or if there's any other types of resources that you think would be useful, we can put our heads together and think if we have anything, and we can share that on our event page as well. But overall, thank you all so much for being here and joining us, and can't wait to hear more about what you've been doing next time.
And I'm grabbing those links because we'll put them in the Hero Hub for everybody real quick. So anyway, we're good.
Awesome.
But let me post the evaluation, and thank you all so much for being here. Iman and Katie, we appreciate you being again partners and part of our work across our grants, and of course our leaders there with us. Thank you so much. And I did want to mention again, Wendy had to join the charge cadre tonight. We had to split up and one do each, but I know you all miss her facilitating and being here with you all. I love being with you all, so I hope we've done you all a fantastic job. There, let me post the evaluation and make sure you all complete that. And again, I'll hang on as long as you need me to stay. And then if you have any questions, I see Amon's posted her email in there. if you have any questions about QFT or anything about KEDC grants or anything that I need to relay to Wendy, I'll be more than happy to do that. And then we're here to serve and help you all in any way. But thank you all for being a part. So
Yeah.